A faint buzz of conversation fills the cabin as passengers settle into their seats. The hum of the engines adds a steady rhythm to the air, a comforting reminder that they're in the hands of experienced professionals. The flight attendants glide through the aisles, smiling politely, ensuring seatbelts are fastened and carry-ons are properly stored. It's an ordinary flight, just like thousands of others that crisscross the skies every day. Or at least it seems that way, for now. Seated near the back of the plane is a group of bikers, their leather jackets and bald patches unmistakable. They're loud, laughing boisterously, clearly enjoying their trip. Most of the passengers try to ignore the disruption, burying their noses in books or scrolling through their phones. But for some, the bikers' behavior is hard to overlook. One of them leans into the aisle, casually tossing a remark at a passing flight attendant. It's not friendly, and her strained smile shows it. At first, it's just words, little comments, snide remarks aimed at anyone within earshot. A passenger a few rows ahead turns to glance at them, and one of the bikers sneers, "Got a problem, buddy?" The man quickly faces forward again, gripping his armrest. It's the kind of situation where most people choose silence over confrontation, but not everyone is willing to look the other way. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer are running through their routine. Captain Richard Bennett, a seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience, knows the drill. To him, every flight is about precision and safety. The plane, the passengers, the crew, it's all his responsibility. His calm demeanor and sharp instincts have earned him respect in the aviation world. But today, he'll need more than just flying skills. Unbeknownst to the passengers and crew, Captain Bennett has been keeping an eye on the situation. Through the small security cameras positioned in the cabin, he's aware of the brewing tension. What starts as mild annoyance quickly escalates as the bikers' antics grow bolder. One of them stands up, despite the seatbelt sign still being on, and starts rummaging through the overhead compartment. A flight attendant approaches, gently reminding him to sit down. He responds with a dismissive wave and a muttered insult. Another biker laughs loudly, egging him on. Passengers begin shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the tension palpable. Captain Bennett watches, his expression unreadable. He's seen all sorts of behavior during his years in the skies. Nervous flyers, unruly kids, even the occasional disruptive passenger. But this feels different. He adjusts his headset, glancing at the first officer. "Keep an eye on the controls. I need to handle something," he says, his voice steady. As he steps out of the cockpit, heads turn. He's an imposing figure, tall and confident, with a presence that demands attention. The cabin falls quiet as he walks down the aisle, the leather-clad group now aware of his approach. The lead biker, a burly man with a thick beard and a cocky grin, locks eyes with him. "What's the problem, Captain?" the biker asks, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His friends chuckle, clearly entertained. Captain Bennett doesn't flinch. His gaze is calm, but there's an edge to it, an unspoken warning that demands respect. The tension in the air is almost unbearable. Passengers hold their breath, waiting to see what will happen next. The bikers, confident in their numbers, seem unfazed. They've probably been in their fair share of confrontations and don't see this one ending any differently. But they don't know who they're dealing with. Captain Bennett leans in slightly, his voice low but firm. "Gentlemen," he says, "this isn't just my plane. It's my responsibility. You're disrupting the flight and making my passengers uncomfortable. That ends now." The biker leader smirks, crossing his arms. "And what are you going to do about it?" he taunts. His friends laugh, the sound grating against the otherwise quiet cabin. The captain straightens, his calm demeanor never wavering. "You'll find out soon enough," he replies, his tone leaving no room for argument. Then, without another word, he turns and heads back to the cockpit, leaving the group momentarily stunned. As the door to the cockpit clicks shut, the bikers exchange glances, their bravado faltering just slightly. Passengers whisper among themselves, wondering what the captain's next move will be. They don't have to wait long. Over the intercom, Captain Bennett's voice rings out, calm yet commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Rest assured, your safety and comfort are my top priorities. We'll be addressing this situation shortly. Thank you for your patience." The bikers' laughter dies down as the gravity of the moment sinks in. This isn't the reaction they expected. Captain Bennett isn't just any pilot, he's a man with a plan. And whatever that plan is, it's about to unfold in a way that no one on this flight will ever forget. The cabin felt heavier now, the air thick with unspoken tension. Some passengers tried to act as though nothing was happening, flipping through in-flight magazines or staring out the windows at the endless stretch of clouds. But most couldn't help stealing glances at the group in the back, their loud energy suddenly dampened. The bikers, once full of laughter and smug confidence, now exchanged uneasy looks. The leader, Greg, tried to brush it off. "What's he gonna do? Kick us off mid-air?" he scoffed, leaning back in his seat as if he wasn't bothered. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it doubt? He tugged at the patch on his leather vest, the one that read *Iron Devils*, as though reminding himself of who he was, who they were. They'd faced their share of trouble before. A little turbulence wasn't about to rattle them. Or so he thought. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Bennett sat silently, his hands steady on the controls. The co-pilot, a younger man named Eric, glanced over at him, a question on his face he didn't dare ask aloud. Everyone in the airline knew Captain Bennett had a reputation, not just for his flying skills, but for his ability to handle situations that would leave most people flustered. But even Eric couldn't guess what his captain's next move might be. "Are you sure about this?" Eric finally asked, breaking the silence. Bennett didn't look away from the instruments. "Absolutely." His tone was calm, almost unlovingly so. He adjusted the radio, his movements deliberate. "We're responsible for every soul on this plane, Eric. That means keeping them safe. And sometimes, safe means more than flying through clear skies." Eric nodded, still unsure what that meant. But if there was one thing he'd learned in his years flying with Captain Bennett, it was to trust the man's instincts. They'd never steered him wrong before. Back in the cabin, a flight attendant named Lucy lingered near the galley, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. She'd been working flights for nearly a decade, but this was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Her heart raced as she remembered the way Captain Bennett had looked at her before leaving the cockpit. Steady, reassuring, but also commanding. Just follow my lead. His expression had seemed to say. Lucy took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle, her professional mask firmly in place. She approached a nervous-looking woman sitting a few rows ahead of the bikers and offered her a drink. The woman nodded gratefully, clutching her cup as though it might shield her from whatever was coming next. Lucy moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and keeping an eye on the group in the back. She noticed how the other bikers kept glancing at Greg, waiting for him to make the next call. But Greg just sat there, his jaw tight. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy with a tattoo snaking up his neck, muttered, "This guy's bluffing. He can't do anything up here." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves. A man in a suit leaned over to his seatmate, murmuring, "You think they'll land the plane?" The older woman beside him shook her head. "I don't know, but I wouldn't put anything past that captain. Did you see how calm he was? Like he's dealt with worse." The bikers might not have known it, but Captain Bennett's career was full of moments that demanded cool nerves and quick thinking. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a problem solver, someone who thrived in high-pressure situations. And while the passengers could only speculate about his past, Bennett had already calculated his next steps. In the cockpit, a quiet alert beeped, a message from air traffic control. Bennett scanned the screen, his lips pressing into a thin line. The message confirmed what he'd suspected. The nearest airport with adequate facilities was over an hour away. But he didn't need to divert just yet, not if his plan worked. He leaned into the microphone, his voice steady as it filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently cruising at 35,000 feet. I've spoken to my crew, and we'll be taking measures to ensure this flight remains as smooth and enjoyable as possible for everyone on board. Thank you for your cooperation." The bikers exchanged glances again, the vague announcement unsettling them. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What's his game?" he muttered, mostly to himself. Lucy returned to the galley, her hands trembling slightly. Another flight attendant, Maria, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's got this," Maria said softly. Lucy nodded, forcing a small smile. She wanted to believe that. In the back of the plane, Greg stood up, ignoring the looks from the other passengers. He walked toward the galley, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Lucy tensed as he approached. "Hey," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "Got any more of those little pretzels? The guys are hungry." Lucy hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the intercom where the captain's voice had just come through. "I'll check," she said, keeping her tone neutral. She reached for a bag of snacks and handed it to him. Greg didn't move right away. Instead, he looked her over, his expression hard to read. "You're shaking," he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Relax. We're not bad guys." Lucy forced a polite smile. "We're here to make sure everyone has a comfortable flight. That includes you." Greg chuckled, stepping back with the bag of pretzels. "See, we're cooperating. No need to make a big deal out of nothing." As he walked back to his seat, Lucy let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The bikers laughed as Greg tossed the bag onto the tray table, but their laughter didn't carry the same confidence it had earlier. Something had shifted. In the cockpit, Captain Bennett watched the cabin camera feed, his eyes narrowing slightly. He adjusted his headset and spoke quietly into the radio. "Security team, stand by for confirmation. I'll notify you of any further action needed." The voice on the other end responded immediately. "Understood, Captain." The co-pilot glanced at Bennett, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Security team." Bennett leaned back in his seat, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "Sometimes, Eric, the skies aren't as peaceful as they seem, and it's our job to make sure they stay that way." The younger man nodded, though he still didn't fully understand what the captain was planning. One thing was clear, though, this wasn't just another flight. Back in the cabin, the biker's leader leaned his head back against his seat, staring at the ceiling. The laughter among them had died down, replaced by quiet muttering. Passengers continued to watch them cautiously, their curiosity now mixed with unease. And above it all, the steady hum of the engines carried the plane forward, through the skies and into the unknown. Whatever was coming next, no one on board was ready for it. But one thing was certain, Captain Bennett was. The cabin seemed quieter now, but it was the kind of quiet that felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. People exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves frayed by the unspoken tension hanging in the air. The bikers, once the loudest voices on the plane, had grown noticeably subdued, though their presence still felt like a storm cloud at the back of the cabin. Greg, their leader, sat with his arms crossed, staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. His companions whispered among themselves, their bravado giving way to murmured uncertainty. Near the front, a young boy clutched his mother's hand tightly. He had wide, curious eyes that darted between the bikers and the flight attendants. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Are we in trouble?" His mother smiled down at him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "No, sweetie, everything's fine," she said softly, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. Lucy, back in the galley, took a sip of water, trying to calm her racing heart. Maria stood beside her, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed. "You think the captain's bluffing?" Maria asked quietly, glancing toward the cockpit. Lucy shook her head. "No, he doesn't bluff. Whatever he's planning, it's going to work." She wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure Maria or herself. Either way, she clung to the hope that Captain Bennett had everything under control. Greg leaned over to one of his companions, his voice low but firm. "They're trying to spook us. That's all this is." He glanced toward the cockpit door, his jaw tightening. "But I'm not about to let some pilot push us around." One of the younger bikers, Jake, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, but what if he's serious? You heard what he said. He's got a plan, and we don't know what it is." Greg shot him a sharp look. "Don't lose your nerve now. We've handled worse. Just stick to the plan." Jake nodded, though his unease was evident. The bikers had always relied on their numbers and their reputation to get what they wanted, but this was different. They weren't on the ground, where they could walk away if things got out of hand. Up here, thousands of feet above the earth, they were at the mercy of the captain. Captain Bennett, meanwhile, sat calmly in the cockpit, monitoring the situation through the cabin cameras. His expression was composed, but his mind was working through every possible scenario. He knew that the bikers were testing the limits, trying to see how far they could push before someone pushed back. And he knew that his response had to be measured, decisive, and above all, effective. Eric glanced at him, his curiosity getting the better of him. "So, what's the play here? Are we landing early? Calling in security?" Bennett shook his head. "Not yet. Diverting the flight is a last resort. It causes chaos for everyone on board, and we're not there yet. But if they cross the line again..." He trailed off, his tone making it clear he was prepared for that possibility. In the cabin, the passengers were starting to form their own alliances. The man in the suit, who had been quietly observing the bikers, leaned over to the woman sitting beside him. "I've seen guys like them before," he said in a hushed tone. "They're all bark, no bite. But they thrive on people being too scared to stand up to them." The woman nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe. But we're not exactly in a position to fight back, are we? We're in the air, and they're the ones making the rules right now." Across the aisle, an older man with a grizzled beard and a weathered face listened in. "The captain's got a plan," he said, his voice low but confident. "You can see it in his eyes. He's not gonna let them get away with this." Greg's voice cut through the cabin, breaking the fragile silence. "Hey," he called out to Lucy, who was walking down the aisle with a tray of drinks. "How about another round for me and my boys? We're feeling a little parched." Lucy stopped, her grip tightening on the tray. She turned to face him, her professional mask firmly in place. "I'll see what I can do," she said, her voice steady despite the fear prickling at the edges. Greg smirked, leaning back in his seat. "That's more like it," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. His companions chuckled, but it was a hollow sound, lacking the confidence it had earlier. As Lucy walked back toward the galley, Greg's gaze lingered on her, his smirk fading. He couldn't shake the feeling that the captain's calm demeanor was more than just a bluff. And the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. In the cockpit, Captain Bennett leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the controls. He reached for the intercom, his voice filling the cabin once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to thank you all for your cooperation and understanding. Please know that my crew and I are fully committed to ensuring a safe and comfortable journey for everyone on board. If at any point you feel unsafe or have concerns, please don't hesitate to alert a member of the crew." The message was simple, but it carried weight. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and anticipation. The bikers, however, heard the unspoken warning loud and clear. Jake leaned toward Greg, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we're pushing it too far? Maybe we should just cool it." Greg scowled, his pride refusing to let him back down. "He's not gonna do anything. He's just trying to scare us." But even as he said it, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that he was wrong. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, filling the cabin with an almost oppressive sound. Every little movement or noise seemed amplified. The rustling of a magazine, the soft clink of ice in a glass, the creak of a seat adjusting. Passengers sat on edge, their nervous energy palpable. Some glanced at the bikers, Others stole looks toward the cockpit, wondering what the captain's next move would be. Whatever it was, they felt it coming. Everyone did. Greg shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers on the armrest. He tried to act casual, but his tension was obvious to anyone watching closely. His confidence wasn't what it had been an hour ago. The captain hadn't so much as raised his voice, yet Greg felt like he was playing a game of chess and had somehow landed in check without realizing it. "Relax, man," said one of the bikers beside him, a tall, lanky guy nicknamed Red. "You're overthinking it. He's just talking big to freak us out." Greg nodded, but his jaw was tight. "Yeah, maybe." His eyes flicked toward the cockpit door again, a sliver of doubt creeping into his mind. Meanwhile, Jake sat quietly, his hands fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket. He kept stealing glances at the other passengers, many of whom were now openly watching their group. The disapproving stares, the whispered conversations, they all made his stomach churn. He leaned closer to Greg. "Look, maybe we should just back off, you know. We've got nothing to prove here." Greg turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "What, you scared? We're not doing anything wrong. They're the ones trying to make this into a big deal." Jake didn't respond, but his silence said more than words ever could. Greg sat back, his scowl deepening. He hated feeling cornered, and right now, that's exactly how he felt. At the front of the plane, Lucy stood near the galley, watching the cabin with a sharp, observant gaze. She noticed everything: the way Greg kept glancing toward the cockpit, the nervous energy radiating off Jake, the subtle shift in the biker's demeanor. They weren't as sure of themselves as they had been, and that gave her a small flicker of hope. Maria joined her, speaking quietly. "Do you think they're backing down?" Lucy shook her head. "Not yet, but they're definitely rattled." She glanced toward the cockpit door. "The captain's got them thinking. That's a good start." Inside the cockpit, Captain Bennett adjusted his headset, his eyes scanning the controls and the cabin cameras. The tension in the cabin was reaching a breaking point, and he knew the next move had to be calculated perfectly. He turned to Eric. "Contact ground control. Let them know we may need assistance on landing." Eric's hands moved quickly over the radio, relaying the message. His voice was steady, but there was a trace of unease in his eyes. "What's the plan, Captain?" he asked once the transmission was complete. Bennett didn't answer immediately. He was focused, his mind working through the possibilities. Finally, he said, "We need to make it clear that this isn't their domain. They think they're in control, but they're not, and it's time they realized that." Back in the cabin, Greg stood up abruptly, drawing the attention of everyone around him. He stretched his arms, glancing toward the aisle with a calculated casualness. "I'm gonna take a walk," he muttered to no one in particular, stepping into the aisle. Passengers stiffened, some leaning away as he passed. Greg didn't miss their reactions, and it fed his frustration. He wasn't used to being treated like the bad guy, at least, not in a way that made him feel powerless. As he approached the galley, Lucy stepped aside, her expression neutral but alert. "Need something?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Greg smirked, leaning casually against the counter. "Just stretching my legs," he said, his eyes scanning the area. He spotted the cockpit door and lingered on it for a moment, then turned back to Lucy. "You all seem a little jumpy. Everything okay?" Lucy met his gaze without flinching. "Everything's fine, sir. We're just focused on keeping the flight smooth for everyone." Greg tilted his head, studying her. "Aha, smooth flight. Sure." He pushed off the counter, his smirk fading slightly as he made his way back toward his seat. But the moment he sat down, the intercom crackled to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I want to thank you for your patience as we work to ensure a safe and comfortable experience for everyone. I'd like to remind all passengers that we have zero tolerance for any behavior that disrupts the flight or jeopardizes the safety of our crew and passengers. Thank you for your cooperation." The message was simple, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, while the bikers sat in tense silence. Greg clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he stared out the window. The captain's words had struck a nerve, and he hated the feeling of being called out without being named directly. Jake broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe he's serious, Greg. What if?" "Enough," Greg snapped, his voice low but sharp. "We're not doing anything wrong. He's just trying to mess with us." But even as he said it, Greg couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in his gut. The captain wasn't bluffing, he was certain of that now. And whatever came next, Greg knew it wasn't going to be good. The air inside the cabin felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Greg tapped his fingers against his leg, his mind racing even as he tried to maintain an outward appearance of control. His companions weren't faring much better. Red had gone quiet, his usual snide remarks replaced by a vacant stare out the window. Jake was still fidgeting, his eyes darting between Greg and the passengers, who continued to watch them like hawks. It was clear that their grip on the situation was slipping. Then something happened that caught everyone off guard. A soft chime rang through the cabin, and the seatbelt sign illuminated. Passengers murmured in confusion. There had been no announcement about turbulence or descent. Lucy and Maria exchanged a quick look before Maria headed toward the cockpit. Lucy stayed near the galley, keeping an eye on the bikers, who were now looking just as confused as the other passengers. Greg leaned toward Red. "What's this about?" he muttered, his voice low and tense. Red shrugged, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his unease. Maybe he's just trying to mess with us again, keep everyone on edge. But Greg wasn't so sure. The captain had been deliberate and precise in everything he'd done so far. This didn't feel random. It felt calculated, and that realization made his stomach churn. In the cockpit, Captain Bennett glanced at Eric, who nodded, confirming that the signal had been activated. The captain leaned into the intercom again, his voice calm, but with an edge that sent shivers down the spines of everyone listening. "Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to give you a brief update. We've encountered a minor technical issue that requires some additional measures for safety. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we address the situation. Thank you for your understanding." The announcement was vague, almost cryptic, and it had the desired effect. Passengers grew uneasy, their whispered conversations growing more urgent. Lucy fielded a barrage of questions from nearby passengers, maintaining her professionalism despite the rising tension. But it wasn't just the passengers who were rattled. The bikers were visibly unnerved now, their earlier bravado almost completely gone. Greg leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him and his crew, their suspicion and disapproval like a weight pressing down on him. He hated feeling like he was losing control, and right now, that's exactly what was happening. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Let's see what this guy's really up to." He stood again, ignoring the pointed looks from the passengers and the whispered protests from Jake. Greg's confidence faltered for a split second as he approached the galley, but he forced himself to keep moving. Lucy intercepted him, stepping into the aisle with a practiced ease that belied the tension in her shoulders. "Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your seat," she said firmly, her voice calm but unyielding. "For your safety and the safety of others, it's important to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." Greg smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You really think I'm buying this whole technical issue thing? I just want to have a quick word with your captain. Clear the air, you know." Lucy didn't flinch. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir. The captain is focused on addressing the situation, and we need all passengers to cooperate." Greg's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm not looking for trouble, but your captain's playing games, and I'm not in the mood for it." Lucy met his gaze, her composure unwavering. "The captain's priority is the safety of everyone on board. I suggest you take your seat and let us do our jobs." For a moment, Greg hesitated, caught off guard by her resolve. But before he could respond, the plane jolted slightly, as if hitting a pocket of turbulence. The motion wasn't severe, but it was enough to send a ripple of anxiety through the cabin. Passengers gasped, clutching their armrests or each other. Greg stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of a seat. He looked around, his scowl deepening. What the hell was that? Lucy's calm expression didn't waver. Please, sir, return to your seat. The captain will address any concerns as soon as it's safe to do so. Greg opened his mouth to argue, but another jolt interrupted him, this one slightly more pronounced. His companions were now visibly on edge, exchanging uneasy glances. Even Red, who rarely showed emotion, looked shaken. Back in the cockpit, Captain Bennett monitored the situation carefully, his hands steady on the controls. The slight adjustments to the plane's trajectory weren't enough to alarm ground control, but they were enough to make a point. He glanced at the cabin camera feed, noting Greg's reaction with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Looks like they're starting to crack, Eric said, his tone a mix of relief and anticipation. Bennett nodded. We're not there yet, but they're beginning to realize they're not in control. Now we just need to keep the pressure on. In the cabin, Greg finally relented, muttering under his breath as he made his way back to his seat. His frustration was clear, but so was his uncertainty. The bikers sat in tense silence, their earlier confidence now a distant memory. As the plane leveled out, the passengers began to relax slightly, but the tension was far from gone. People whispered among themselves, speculating about the captain's plan and what might happen next. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath for the next move in this high-stakes game. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, the bikers sat frozen, their bravado completely drained. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the cockpit. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. The passengers were quiet now, their murmurs replaced by an uneasy silence. Everyone was waiting, watching, wondering what the captain's next move would be. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life again. Captain Bennett's voice, calm and steady as ever, filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I'd like to inform you that we've made arrangements for a special landing at an alternate airfield. Security personnel will meet us upon arrival to ensure the safety of all passengers. We appreciate your cooperation during this process. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their whispers starting up again. The bikers looked at each other, their faces pale. Greg clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the armrests. This wasn't what he had expected. He had assumed the captain's warnings were bluffs, empty words meant to intimidate. But now, the reality of the situation was sinking in. Security personnel? Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Greg, what's he talking about? They're going to be waiting for us when we land. Greg didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this mess. But no matter how he turned it over in his head, he couldn't see an escape. The captain had them cornered, and there was nothing they could do. Red leaned in, his voice low and urgent. Maybe we should come clean. If we just explain it was a misunderstanding. It's too late for that, Greg snapped, though his voice lacked its usual force. He was losing control, and he knew it. The plane began its descent, the engines humming steadily as the ground grew closer. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable now. Lucy and Maria moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and offering reassurances, though their own nerves were evident. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the wheels would touch down. When the plane finally landed, the cabin erupted in a wave of nervous chatter. The bikers sat rigid in their seats, their eyes fixed on the windows as the plane taxied to a secluded part of the airfield. Outside, a line of security vehicles was already visible, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow against the dark tarmac. Greg's chest tightened. He had always prided himself on being able to handle any situation, but this was unlike anything he faced before. He turned to his crew, his voice low and urgent. Stick together. Don't say anything unless I tell you to. The cabin door opened, and a team of uniformed officers stepped aboard. Their presence was commanding, and the cabin fell silent as they moved purposefully toward the back. Captain Bennett appeared in the doorway of the cockpit, his expression calm but firm. He nodded to the lead officer, then stepped aside. Greg stood up, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. All right. No need to make a scene, he said, his voice forced into a tone of calm. The officers didn't respond, moving swiftly to escort him and his crew off the plane. The passengers watched in stunned silence as the bikers were led away, their earlier bravado now replaced with resignation. As the officers filed out, one of them paused to speak with Captain Bennett. Their exchange was brief, but the captain's composed demeanor didn't waver. He turned back to the cabin, addressing the passengers with a reassuring smile. Thank you all for your patience and cooperation. We'll be back on our way shortly. Please remain seated as we prepare to resume our flight. The passengers broke into relieved applause, the tension that had gripped the cabin finally dissolving. Lucy and Maria exchanged a look of shared relief, their smiles genuine for the first time since the ordeal began. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Captain Bennett returned to the cockpit. Eric glanced at him, a mix of admiration and curiosity in his expression. That was something, Captain. I didn't think they'd fold like that. Bennett smiled faintly, adjusting his headset. People like that rely on fear to get what they want. Take that away, and they're just like anyone else. Uncertain, vulnerable. He paused, his gaze steady. But you always have to be ready for the unexpected. As the plane lifted off the ground, the passengers settled into a newfound sense of calm. But in the back of the cabin, Lucy noticed something unusual. An older man, who had been quietly observing the bikers earlier, stood up and moved toward the galley. His movements were deliberate, almost too calm. She stepped forward to intercept him, her instincts on high alert. "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. The man smiled faintly, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Oh, nothing to worry about," he said, his tone smooth. "Just wanted to stretch my legs after all that excitement." But Lucy didn't miss the way his hand hovered near his pocket, or the way his gaze lingered on the now-closed cockpit door. Her heart raced as she realized that, while one threat had been neutralized, another might just be beginning. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as she watched the older man's calm, deliberate movements. The cabin lights cast soft shadows across his face, but there was something unsettling in the sharpness of his gaze. He didn't seem rattled by the events that had just unfolded. If anything, he looked entirely too composed. "Sir," Lucy said again, her voice steady but firm. "I'll need you to return to your seat. We're still climbing, and it's for your safety." The man paused, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course," he replied, his tone easygoing. But instead of turning back, he reached into his pocket. Lucy's stomach dropped, her instincts screaming at her to act. Before she could say anything, the man pulled out a small notebook and pen, holding them up like a magician revealing a harmless trick. "I was just jotting down some thoughts," he said, his smile widening. "The adrenaline of a situation like this, it makes you reflective, don't you think?" Lucy exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. She forced a polite smile, though her eyes never left his hands. "I'm sure it does, sir, but I'll have to insist you take your seat." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You're right, of course. Rules are rules." He turned and made his way back to his seat, moving with an unhurried ease that kept Lucy's nerves on edge. Something about him didn't sit right, but with the immediate threat of the bikers gone, she decided not to press further. For now. As the plane leveled off, the tension in the cabin finally began to dissipate. Passengers settled back into their seats, whispering among themselves about the dramatic events they had just witnessed. Some speculated about what the bikers had planned, while others expressed gratitude for the captain's calm leadership. In the galley, Lucy joined Maria, who handed her a cup of water. "You okay?" Maria asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Lucy nodded, taking a sip. "Yeah, just that guy in 14C. Did you notice anything off about him?" Maria glanced toward the back of the plane, where the man was seated. He seemed quiet, didn't say much during the whole ordeal. Why? Lucy shook her head. I don't know, just a feeling. Maria placed a reassuring hand on her arm. After everything that's happened, I think we're all on edge. But the bikers are gone, and the captain's got everything under control. Let's just focus on getting through the rest of this flight. Lucy nodded, though the unease in her chest didn't completely fade. In the cockpit, Captain Bennett was reviewing the flight plan with Eric, ensuring their revised schedule would cause minimal disruption for the passengers. The earlier events had been a test of his leadership, but now that the immediate threat was resolved, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. You did good out there, Eric said, breaking the silence. Kept everyone calm and handled those guys without it escalating into something worse. Bennett smiled faintly. It's all about staying ahead of the situation. Once you let fear dictate your actions, you lose control. Eric nodded, his respect for the captain evident. Still, I don't envy you. That was a lot to manage. Bennett leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful. It's part of the job. You prepare for the unexpected and trust your instincts when the time comes. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully. Lucy kept an eye on the older man in 14C, but he didn't make any further moves that raised alarm. When the plane finally touched down at their original destination, the passengers erupted into applause, relieved to have reached the ground safely after such a turbulent journey. As the passengers disembarked, many of them stopped to thank the crew and express their admiration for the captain's composure. Greg and his crew were nowhere to be seen, having been taken into custody at the alternate airfield. Their departure left an air of closure, though questions lingered about their intentions and why they had targeted this flight. When the older man in 14C passed Lucy on his way out, he paused, his expression unreadable. You've got good instincts, he said quietly. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Lucy blinked, caught off guard, but before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of passengers exiting the terminal. She watched him go, a mixture of relief and lingering curiosity swirling in her mind. Back at the gate, Captain Bennett met with Lucy and Maria, thanking them for their professionalism and calm under pressure. You both handled yourselves exceptionally well, he said, his tone sincere. Situations like this aren't easy, but you kept the passengers safe and reassured. Lucy smiled, though the weight of the day still lingered. Thank you, Captain. It was a team effort. As they parted ways, Lucy found herself replaying the events of the flight in her mind. The bikers, the captain's steady leadership, the strange man in 14C. It all felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But in the end, everyone had made it through safely, and that was what mattered most. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Lucy took a deep breath, letting the tension finally melt away. The day had been a reminder of how unpredictable life could be, but also of the strength and resilience people could show in the face of uncertainty. And with that thought, she turned toward the terminal, ready to move forward, whatever came next.